Donald Fagen. It's been over a decade since one of today's most intriguing and elusive artists released his acclaimed solo album, The Nightfly. Now, Donald Fagen returns with Kamakiriad, and from the evidence of these 8 new songs, including the single Tomorrow's Girls, it's been worth the wait. Hello, and welcome to Words and Music, featuring Donald Fagen and his new Reprise Records release, Kamakiriad. With Steely Dan partner Walter Becker at the production helm, Kamakiriad is a dazzling journey into a brave new world with some of the most adventurous music of Donald Fagen's career. And now, here's Donald Fagen.
On a literal level, Kamakiriad is about a journey that the narrator takes in a special sort of car. The story takes place a few years in the future, and the car has some super technology. It has a link with a satellite called TripStar, which is a routing satellite that helps him find his destination. It has, peculiar gauges. Also a bionic farm in the back, which is a self-sufficient food supply. And it's essentially a kind of a new age sort of car. It's an environmentally correct car. And I felt that by placing the story a few years in the future, it allowed me to have a certain amount of detachment from the story, which can be seen, at least on one level, as autobiographical. The science fiction angle, I think, works as it's worked for a lot of science fiction writers who write stories and novels, in the way that it sort of removes the sentimentality from what is potentially an over-sentimental story. The Kamakiri is a car which I made up. In Japanese, it means praying mantis, which I thought was a great name for a car. It's a combination of various super technologies from different parts of the world, and it's the kind of car I guess I imagined I'd like to drive a few years in the future towards the millennium. I don't know if I ever had a total visualization in my mind of what the car looked like, but I guess I thought of it as being kind of a medium-sized car with perhaps the garden would be covered by some sort of bubble, and the tires, I guess I thought of as being rather large. And I guess one of the main things is I felt that the car didn't really drive very quickly. It was actually move fairly slowly. The idea being that in the future, speed would be something which is no longer of that much value, and rather slow and thoughtful progress, perhaps with something to be desired. The car is propelled by steam, which makes it environmentally correct. I could easily see it stopping at a steam station to be refilled. It would obviously have a boiler of some sort in order to produce the steam. And as I say, because the car doesn't really have to move so fast, it really doesn't need that much energy to drive it. The Kamakiri is a product of many nations. I guess I see it as being planned not so much as a technical feat, but rather as a work of art, really. And it's kind of wishful thinking, I guess, on my part, that perhaps architecture and technology would be conceived along the lines of art rather than along the lines of expedience in the future. Kamakiriad was an album that I felt I had to do alone. The concept was something I came up with by myself, and I wrote all the tunes, except for one tune that Walter and I collaborated on in the mid-'80s. I felt that, in a way, the album was really a follow-up to The Nightfly, in that it sort of continued in an autobiographical vein. It's been a long time since Nightfly came out. I believe it was 1981. 11 years is really, it's a long time. I mean, if you think about novelists or painters who aren't working in a popular medium, it's kind of accepted that an artist, will need to develop something for a number of years. But In the record business, which is, a popular medium, you're supposed to just, keep socking out those records. And I think that's part of the problem, is just I'm working in a medium, both an artistic medium and an entertainment medium. And so I guess really what happened was, after Nightfly, I had a bit of a writer's block, and since I was having trouble writing tunes that I really thought were successful, I took a number of other musical jobs during the 80s. I co-produced a soundtrack album of Bob Telson's music for Gospel of Colonus, an off-Broadway musical. Composed a film score for a film called Bright Lights, Big City. Wrote some material for other people, the Yellow Jackets and a few other groups. And then in the late 80s, I finally sort of got some energy back, some creative energy, and came up with the idea for this album, Kamakiriad. Simultaneously, I was involved in the New York Rock and Soul Review with my friend and now my wife, Libby Titus. A concept we came up with in which a number of singers would revive some of the old great soul tunes from golden age of soul from the early and late 60s. And we did a couple shows at the Beacon Theater, and then toured with that group, including Phoebe Snow and Mike McDonald and some other great singers in the summer of '92.
I would love to tour the Southland.
The 80s generally were a period of self-examination for me. And when I started playing live, though, around New York and eventually elsewhere with the Rock and Soul Review, I think it did give me some energy, which allowed me to start writing again. Like the Nightfly, Kamakiriad is a series of songs which are loosely connected. If you're trying to write an album in which the songs are tied together, there's always a danger that you'll have to use too much exposition or too much explanation, which would make the album seem didactic and boring. I trust the listener to fill in some of the things which might be missing, some of the details. They used to call these things concept albums back in the 60s and 70s, and that's good enough a title, I think. Usually concept albums were sort of said in a sort of negative way because simply most of those weren't very successful. Hopefully Kamakiriad is successful in that you can listen to it all the way through and get something out of it that you wouldn't by, listening to a song here and there. Essentially, though, the first song, Trans Island Skyway, announces that the narrator has bought this terrific car and that he's going to be traveling on a journey which is going to be very exhilarating and yet has some danger about it. Because he's traveling in apocalyptic times, there's all sorts of natural disasters to be avoided and all kinds of bizarre adventures he might be having. He says at one point that this route could be trouble, and in fact he does run into trouble during his journey. The next 6 songs, there's 8 altogether, the next 6 songs are really represent adventures or detours that he runs into along the way. Some of the songs occurred to me in sequence, or I had an idea of the kind of arc of the story, but the songs weren't all written in sequence. In fact, On the Dunes, which is the penultimate song, was written in 1983, and in fact before I'd even conceived the project. But when I was putting the songs in order, I realized that On the Dunes would sort of be perfect. My conception is that when he starts this journey, he really doesn't know where he's going. He's, in fact, in a way, sort of makes it up as he goes along, just in the way that I made it up as I went along. chronology is sometimes interrupted by explosions from the past. Specifically, the song Springtime concerns an amusement park that he stops at along the way called Springtime. The introduction is the exposition, and it tells you there's this place called Springtime. It's the most popular attraction on the Funway, and in this place they scan your brain for the memories of your early romances and then play it back to you in some sort of magnificent virtual theater. Then when the actual song begins after the introduction, you actually see some of these scenes recreated. At that point, the music becomes manic rather than nostalgic, because nostalgia is really kind of a trap, I think, that we fall into sometimes that prevents us from moving forward. And I feel like by putting essentially the wrong music underneath the lyric, basically trying to sabotage the sentimentality. The album to me seems to be about loss in a lot of ways. You know, one of the ways people experience loss directly is when a relationship goes bad. It's not that uncommon a thing for someone to wake up in the morning and look at his mate and not really know who he's looking at anymore. You know, people tend to change, grow in different directions, and I think the most extreme form of that is when you look at the person you're living with and decide that they may as well be from Mars, essentially. When it becomes obvious that there's some lack of communication between you, or perhaps things are starting to go wrong, sometimes seems as if the person you're living with has been replaced by an alien. Well, I think that in Kamakiriad, the characters, narrators trying to recover some of this optimism, or perhaps naive optimism that he had as a child, and as is spelled out in Nightfly. I think sort of the way it ends up is the character at the end is still optimistic, but without the naivete. In other words, he's basically is much more in contact with reality, and yet and realizes the harshness of reality, and yet maintains a kind of optimism. So I try to keep my own personal politics out of the stuff I do, aside from the spillover that happens when you create something that's part of yourself. I think that a lot of the elements, the attention to to seeing the world as a planet moving in space that we all exist on, the car is going through territory in which tide pools are boiling and plates are grinding, and these are really natural disasters. For instance, the song Snowbound is about a city that's constantly has really bad weather. Its streets are icy and it's always snowing and hailing and so on, and the narrator gets trapped in this place for a while and starts to share the decadent lifestyle of some of the dwellers of the city. I guess I imagine him really having to fight to get out of this place. Of course, I can't detail everything, but maybe the movie version will be more explicit. The album took about 2 years to complete. Because Walter lives in Hawaii and didn't want to spend that much time away from his family, he would come to New York, where I live, for 6 weeks, and then I'd perhaps write a couple more songs for a while, and then I'd spend 6 weeks working with him at his home studio in Hawaii. So, there were a lot of breaks, and it was not a particularly hurried schedule. It was kind of relaxed, but altogether it took about 2 years. On this record, I felt that I wanted to have more control, or you might say even more control than I've had on other records. So I played all the keyboard parts myself, and also arranged the rhythm tracks myself, and even, in fact, did the horn arrangements myself. In the past, I'd always had someone help me with voicing the horns, but I felt that if I wrote the arrangements fairly simply, the music would be more unified if I just, if everything was sort of bent to my own conception. I think the music is unified in the sense that one of the most important things to me when I was doing the arrangements was the groove of the tune. I was looking for something very specific in the way of groove, and in fact made essentially the demos that I used to start with were very specific as to the groove, and I wanted the groove to be aggressive and yet very relaxed at the same time, and the groove is so consistent that when you get to the end of the album, it's easy just to kind of loop around back to the first tune. With Walter producing, we first started to think about other musicians we would use, and we realized that, certainly I realized that the bass player I'd most rather have play on the thing was Walter. So he ended up doing all the bass parts and all the lead guitar. If it sounds like a Steely Dan record, there's a good reason for it. I feel that I, more than any other record, I got the finished product to sound the way I imagined they would come out. I didn't really know where I was going exactly. I think it's a psychological journey that's taking place literally in space rather than in the psychological space. I mean, the last song on the album, T.S. on the Tracks, was the last song that I wrote. I really didn't know where this guy was going to end up in his car until I wrote that song. So there was a sense of suspense about writing the record as to whether I'd actually, come up with some kind of conclusion. T.S. on the Tracks, he finally arrives at this town, which I call Fly Town. It's, this nasty little place, the kind of unfamiliar town where psychologically he's totally feels totally abandoned and just about to cash it in, really. And he hears this band playing from a place on his second-story window, and he finds out it's a little club called the Tea House on the Tracks. And he walks in there, and he finds people from his past on the bandstand. And people, certain kind of joy they're experiencing, which, has become totally unfamiliar to him. And by meditating on his past and sort of bringing it back to life again, he experiences this resurrection. He suddenly gets a case of party feet, as it says in the tune. And then the next morning, he gets back into Kamakiriad and heads out into the unknown.
You've been listening to Words and Music with Donald Fagen, featuring music from his new Reprise Records release, Kamakiriad. This program was written and produced by Davin C. and edited by Rick Dasher for Mark Grau Recording Services, Burbank. Executive producer, Larry Butler. This program is copyrighted 1993 by Warner Brothers Records, and no portion of it may be copied or transcribed without written permission.